mantras about things, and basically said, if there's a choice between letting the financial institutions go bankrupt or socking it to the people, you sock it to the people. And so we've been having this going on for some considerable time. In fact, Lula's first response to the crisis was to say, ha ha, it's time you guys up there experience what we've experienced about 4 or 5 times down here over the last 30 years. You're getting disciplined. You should have been disciplined by the IMF a long time ago. The problem was you were the IMF. And since you didn't discipline yourselves, you're now getting disciplined by your indiscipline, so it's all your fault. So, you know, so Lula's kind of, people in Latin America were laughing like crazy at the United States until their economies collapsed as well. And then they said, oh my God, you know, we have to do something as well. So here's the thing we have to start to look at, which is where do crises come from? How has the rhythm of crises proceeded since the 1970s to the current day, present day? What's the dynamic of it? And one of the things you immediately notice is that many of these crises had an urban basis. It's not strange that it's the mortgage market. How did the Japanese boom come to an end? Well, it was a crash of the stock market plus a crash of the land market. And actually land prices in Japan are still going down. Still going down. You look, even inside the United States, we had a huge savings and loan crisis. There was a big housing bust in this country around the same time, 1987, 88, 89, that kind of period. And actually the Swedish banks had to be nationalized in 1992 because of excessive property speculation. The downturn in East and Southeast Asia began with a crash in the Thai property market. So again and again and again, you find these financial crises are tied in some way to financial jiggery-pokery that's going on in the land market and the housing markets. Now, this is an astonishing thing when you say, when you actually read, for example, the last World Bank Development Report, which I think is one of the most scandalous documents I've seen in years, which actually says things like, well, urban development, the best thing you can do is let the market rage. And it will bring you things. And actually, as you mature, you can actually develop a secondary mortgage market, which is going to help you sort of broaden the risk and all this. I mean, it was like, and this published earlier this year, or was it?
2009.
2009, yeah. I mean, in the middle of a crisis, and not once in that report did they mention the fiscal uncertainties and the fiscal ups and downs that have gone on with urban property development. So I want to put that into the hopper and say there's something going on there that needs to be connected. So there's nothing unusual about this being centered in the property world. In fact, if you go back historically, you'll find in the 19th century it was very often in the property world and railroad development booms and all those kinds of things. So what I want to do then is to put that all together in a way that somehow or other could make some simple sense. And there were two things I did. One was I said, well, all right, maybe I should go over what I'd done in the neoliberalism book and say, how did the configuration of the last crisis and the solutions that emerged from the last crisis actually dictate the terms of this crisis? Now, it's a little bit of a complicated argument, but the simple version is, the end of the 1960s and early 1970s, labor was too strong relative to capital. And labor was able to be strong because you had national economies with states in charge of their own fiscal policies, which could be affected by democratic institutions like labor parties and social democratic parties and all the rest of it, so that actually labor could actually change the social wage by forcing many aspects of a welfare state into being, at the same time as it had considerable power in relationship to capital, because labor was well organized, the trade unions were there, it was organized on the shop floor, but capital could respond partially because of the structure by monopolistic pricing practices. The classic example here would be Detroit. Detroit had 3 auto companies and they did price leading, and the workers were in struggle with them and over productivity agreements and everything else, and in the end the companies would concede and then just raise prices. Result was, you know, sort of wage pressures and inflation was going on, and things of that sort began to happen. And during that period, of course, a theory emerged of monopoly capitalism. Baran and Sweezy. The official theory of the French Communist Party during this period was a theory of state monopoly capitalism. And it made sense, because the monopolies were constructed internal to the nation state, which was a viable economic entity. Now, Labour got too strong, so you had to break Labour. How did you break Labour? Well, you broke it in all kinds of ways. The initial way was to try to break it by immigration, and it's astonishing when you think now that back in the 1960s, the Germans were importing the Turks, and the French were importing the Maghrebians, the Swedes were bringing in the Yugoslavs and the Portuguese, the British were drawing on the empire. Actually, the United States actually revised its immigration law in 1965 to give it access to the whole global potential labour market. But of course, immigration created a lot of difficulties. Enoch Powell, rivers of blood, workers, you know, races, you know, I mean, it got very messy. So you went to other things. You went to things like offshoring. But if you're going to offshore, it means you've got to have fluid ways in which capital can pass across boundaries. In other words, you have to start opening up new financial architectures in such a way that you can get capital flow. So if you're producing a car engine in Brazil, and other car parts in Mexico, you can bring it across the border and you can price and all this kind of stuff. So the offshoring begins big time. And it's the threat of offshoring also that starts to discipline labour. And and then there's technological change. The monopoly capital started to be forced into highly competitive modes of activity. And technological change picked up. Workers were less able to resist technological change or cut productivity agreements. And so suddenly the world begins to change in big ways, so that by the middle of the 1980s, essentially the labour problem is solved from the capital standpoint. It has access to massive labour reserves all around the world. It can do what it wants. And okay, there's some resistance here and some resistance there, but interestingly, I have not heard anybody in this crisis say the problem is greedy unions, right? Nobody's seriously put that forward at all. Back in the 1970s, boy, the financial press was full of greedy unions. You have to deal with the greedy unions, if you don't, blah, 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 blah. So it's not a labour problem anymore. What is it? Well, since the 1970s, we've had this fierce attack upon labour, which has created wage repression. And actually, real wages have not really risen anywhere. When you start to look at it in terms of national aggregates, what you see is that the wage share of national income has been steadily declining in all OECD countries, and even more significantly has been declining even in China. Now, if wage income is declining, you've then got a real problem as to how on earth are you going to sell your product? Where's your market going to be? And the answer was, give them credit cards. And so you get the organisation of a debt economy. So households in the United States tripled their indebtedness over the last 30 years. And that indebtedness is taking place in a situation where the wage level is if anything, declining. Sometimes, you know, periods when it went up and then periods when it went down. So you have this wage repression, and you have a debt economy emerging. And you have a highly competitive situation. Detroit suddenly, which was in a monopoly situation, oligopoly situation, you won't be technical about it, in the 1950s and 1960s, suddenly finds itself having to compete with all the Japanese and the German auto companies, and it becomes a highly competitive situation. The level of competition picks up between capital. And as capital gets more competitive, so prices go down and profit margins go down. So you end up with a very peculiar situation in the 1980s, a low wage economy and a low profit margin economy. At the same time as there's a low wage economy, you're redistributing income like crazy to the upper classes, because that's what neoliberalism was always about. And that is legitimized by saying, you know, it's important we give them the money because they invest. And when they invest, they create jobs and blah, blah, blah. I mean, it sounded like my mother. My mother used to say about capital, she'd say, how come you want to get rid of the capitalists? They give us jobs. And I'd say, well, I want to get rid of them because there are other ways of getting